Okay, um, today we're going to look at Elizabeth Anscombe's article, War and Murder, and we're also going to talk about the doctrine of double effect, which plays a big part in her article. And it's also just interesting in its own right. So I decided to combine the two presentations, just made more sense to do it that way. This is going to be a lengthy presentation, and it's not going to have a whole lot of silly, funny stuff, but we just got to get down to it. So real quick, Elizabeth Anscombe was a British philosopher who actually just died in 2001. She was at Cambridge most of her academic career. She wrote not just about the ethics of warfare and political philosophy, but she did philosophy of language, something called action theory in philosophy. She was trained in the classics. She did stuff in metaphysics. She was just a very talented um, philosopher in a lot of different areas. Um, and one thing I should note, she was a devout Catholic. And this is obviously going to play a huge role in the article we're reading today. Um, Now, this isn't a class on religious political philosophy, but some of her arguments concerning pacifism and the ethics of war are relevant to non-religious non-Catholics as well, and has garnered a lot of attention from them. So this is just kind of like one of those seminal pieces of recent political philosophy that we got to cover. And I think it's a very rich article. Um, like I said, she just died a couple of years ago. I will acknowledge from the forefront that this was probably one of the more difficult articles to read. Uh, there are some paragraphs that you have to reread several times. So my goal in this presentation is partially just kind of give a structure of her argument, and then try to explain some of the more difficult claims she makes as well. So let's just get down to it. I think there are two main theses in this article. First, it is wrong for governments to kill innocents as a means to killing non-innocents for winning wars. Um, Two, her second thesis, pacifism and the denial of what's this thing that we're going to look at called the doctrine of double effect has resulted in governments killing innocents as means, which she's going to argue is wrong, remember. So let's just go right down to it. She starts off the article with a question. What is a just attitude to the exercise of violent, coercive power on the part of rulers and their subordinate officers? So when is it okay for the state to use violent, coercive power? Through like the military or through the police, for example. Well, she says there are two possible attitudes you could take. Attitude 1. The world is an absolute jungle, and the exercise of coercive power by rulers is just a manifestation of this fact. So it's just symptomatic of the fact that we live in a chaotic place. Not a fun jungle like Disney's The Jungle Book, but more of like a place with very dangerous animals and weird tropical diseases and no rule of law, I suppose. That's kind of what she means by that phrase, jungle. Second attitude, the world is less of a jungle because of the exercise of coercive power by rulers. And this exercise of power is necessary and right. So instead of the exercise of coercive power being a symptom of the world being a jungle, it's kind of like a partial treatment for the world being a jungle. So it's a different way of thinking about it. And she says that you should be glad, according to attitude 2, that this power exists, with the exception of when this power is unjustly exercised. So my question is, what attitude does Anscombe defend? 1 or 2? Dun, 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 dun. Well, if you read the article, you'll know that it's 2. Whew, coughing. She writes, it is so clear that the world is less of a jungle because of rulers and laws, and that the exercise of coercive power is essential to these institutions. It's just obvious, she says. It may not be obvious to those of us in peaceful and law-abiding countries like where she was in England and we are in the United States, that rulers sometimes need to command violence. For those who oppose the force that backs the law will not always stop short of fighting to the death. It cannot always be put down short of fighting to the death. So basically sometimes It's not obvious in places where there's just not a lot of violence, which like here for the most part, but that doesn't mean that the second attitude is wrong. It just means that those who adopt, I guess, the first attitude or need to broaden their horizons. Okay, so here's an argument that she gives for the acceptable use of coercive violent power by legitimate authorities like the state. Premise 1. If the exercise of coercive power by rulers is intrinsically bad, then it is intrinsically evil to violently coerce resistant wills. Premise 2. It is not the case that it is intrinsically evil to violently coerce resistant wills. Conclusion. So it is not the case that the exercise of coercive power by rulers is intrinsically bad. So that's a simple 3-step argument. Modus tollens. No. So the key premises to defend, of course, are 1 and 2. 1, she needs to show the connection between the antecedent, which goes from the word if to then, and then the consequent between then and wills. And then she needs to show the truth of the consequent, the falsity of the consequent, my bad, in premise 2. So, how does she defend it? Well, premise 2 makes sense only if accompanied by a theory of withdrawal from the world as man's only salvation, which she says is a false theory. So remember, premise 2, it is not the case that it is intrinsically evil to violently coerce resistant wills. You can only but that's a false theory. So you can only deny 2 if you think that your only hope is withdrawal. But again, that's false. Further, remember, she's Catholic, and this article, by the way, was written for Catholics. So her intended audience was Catholics. It just so happened that her arguments were so original and so clever that a lot of non-religious persons and not a lot of non-Catholics have paid attention to it. But a lot of it's going to come out, and it's just to get the sense of the article, we got to do it. So for those of you who are not Catholic, just stick with me. So further defensive premise 2, God restrains the devil by means of violence. So this is just, remember, for Catholics, thinking that coercive authority is evil is akin to thinking that flesh and family are evil, but they're not. So neither is coercive authority. So I guess Christians who think the flesh is evil, the coercive authority is evil, might do so for the same reason that the flesh for some reason is evil, but they're not. Coercive authority is essential for societies, and societies are essential for the human good. So coercive authority, by hypothetical syllogism, is essential for the human good by this argument. Okay. 2 non-sequiturs. So that means it does not follow. Non-sequitur. It's a fallacy. It's when you make a claim and then claim that it follows from another claim, when it in fact doesn't follow. So an example of a non-sequitur would be to argue 2 plus 2 equals 4, therefore grass is green. Now, while it's true that grass is green and it's true that 2 plus 2 equals 4, grass is green does not follow from the claim that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So it's a non-sequitur. It's fallacious. Well, Anscombe says there are 2 non-sequitur arguments concerning this use of the coercive authority. She says, first, it does not follow that just because all rulers up until now have been evil, that ruling as such is evil. So, here's an illustration. Remember when Thomas Edison was inventing the light bulb, he tried thousands of different types of filaments or materials before he found one that finally lit up. Now, if someone had said, Thomas, up until now, none of the filaments you've tried have worked. You don't have a working light bulb. Therefore, the concept of a light bulb as such, it's just not possible. You could never invent one. And of course, he hadn't tried everything. This is kind of similar to that. Even if you've had 100 bad rulers in a row, it doesn't follow that ruling as such is bad. And all it takes is one good ruler to show that. There's nothing about the concept of a ruler, or the nature of a ruler as such, that entails that it's going to be evil, even if there are individual rulers that are evil. 2, it does not follow that just because all wars that have been fought up until now have had wickedness on both sides, that there is no such thing as fighting a war justly. So, and she's probably perhaps correct. There has never been a genuinely 100% all the way through just war where both sides fought justly. But it doesn't follow that it's not possible. It very well could be. So those are 2 non-sequiturs she wants to kind of thwart off right off the bat, because or else her article will be pointless. So, what's her main point then? Her main point is, well, she says, the principal wickedness, which is a temptation to those engaged in warfare, is the killing of the innocent, which may often be done with impunity and even to the glory of those who do it. So her main target is intentional killing of the innocent in warfare, which had been done recently. She was writing right after World War II. So she talks about what innocence is. Which, you want to think we need to define innocence. Don't we just all know what it is? But sometimes philosophers like to get a little bit more precise. Ordinary common sense concepts and definitions aren't as, when entered into debates about the morality of something, it helps to make them a bit more precise. So that's what she's doing. So innocence, first off, is a legal notion. And then what's unique about war then is that the innocence or guilt isn't pronounced under existing codes of law by impartial judges. So it's not like when you have two sides fighting in a war. Both sides kind of assume that the other side is guilty. So it's not like there's an impartial judge overseeing the conflict that can pronounce one or the other. And there's a sense, unfortunately, legally speaking, not morally speaking, but legally speaking, that when whoever wins is the quote-unquote innocent. So yeah, like she says, in warfare, the sovereign party acts as kind of a judge, and they use violence, judging to use violence in war. And this sovereign authority is not subject to another authority above it. Like I said, both sides. It's not like both sides have a over authority above them. So war between states is very different than, say, like a legal dispute between two persons in the United States and Indiana. Murder is the deliberate killing of the innocent for its own sake or as a means to some further end. Important definition right there. So first off, murder is not just killing, it's a certain type of killing. Not all killing is murder, whereas certainly all murder is a type of killing. It's deliberate killing. And it's deliberate killing of the innocent. And then she's got two different clauses: for its own sake or as a means to some further end. Now, that as a means to some further end is going to be important. She's going to be relying on this doctrine of the double effect, which we'll unpack soon. And we're going to have to understand that and contrast it with consequentialism. So that as a means to some further end is going to be important, especially when you contrast double effect with consequentialism. Self-defense. She writes, the plea of self-defense, or the defense of someone else, made by a private man who has killed someone else must in conscience, even if not in law, be a plea that the death of the other was not intended, but was a side effect of the measures taken to ward off the attack. So again, you kill someone in self-defense, and this is going to play into the doctrine of double effect, which is going to relate to war. According to Anscombe, when you kill in self-defense, you're not intending to kill the other person. Instead, you're intending to ward off an attack. And that's what makes it acceptable to kill in self-defense, because it's not your intention to kill. Instead, it's your intention to, like, say, preserve your life, ward off attack. But we're going to have to unpack that more. Okay, so what's Anscombe's argument? The denial of this doctrine of double effect, which we haven't even unpacked yet, conjoined with pacifism, has resulted in the killing of innocents. Okay, so to understand this, that's a basic claim right there. The denial of double effect, conjoined with pacifism, has resulted in the killing of innocents. Of course, to understand this claim, or this argument, it's really an argument, we have to understand what double effect is. And we also have to understand how the denial of it, along with pacifism, has resulted in the killing of innocent persons. So, to start off, the doctrine of double effect is a medieval doctrine originating with Thomas Aquinas, and it distinguishes between the foreseen consequences and the intended consequences. So suppose you kill someone in self-defense, you might foresee that that person dies, but you don't intend that the person dies. Instead, you intend to preserve your life. So this is originally, it's not a Catholic doctrine, but it was coined by Catholics, and most Catholics adhere to it. So let's see what the Catholic Encyclopedia has to say about the doctrine of double effect. They say there are 4 conditions of the application of the principle of double effect. So if you have an act that satisfies these 4 conditions, then you've satisfied the principle of double effect. 1, the act itself must be morally good or at least indifferent. So preserving your life in self-defense is morally good. 2, the agent may not positively will the bad effect, but may permit it. So you don't positively will to kill in self-defense, but you permit the killing of another in self-defense. If he, the agent, could attain the good effect without the bad effect, he would do so. So if there was another way to preserve your life in self-defense, you would have done that. And the bad effect is sometimes said to be indirectly voluntary. So it's voluntary, but it's indirectly. Now, of course, the key phrase is indirectly. Can we put some content to that notion of indirectly? 3, the good effect must flow from the action, at least as immediately in the order of causality, though not necessarily in the order of time, as the bad effect. In other words, the good effect must be produced directly by the action, not by the bad effect. Otherwise, an agent would be using a bad means to a good end, which is never allowed. So this is a bit abstract as well. You can't do something bad as a means to something good. Instead, like the bad thing has to have the same direct cause as the good effect. So the bad effect and the good effect have to have the same direct cause. The bad effect can't be a means to the good effect, in which case the good effect would be indirectly caused by the cause and directly caused by the bad effect, I guess. Think about causal change. 4, the good effect must be sufficiently desirable to compensate for the allowing of the bad effect. I'm going to have another presentation on double effect. So I think the more you get hit with it from many different angles, from many different presentations, from many different readings, the more you'll grasp it. So a lot of this stuff is abstract. Just stick with me. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is also a very helpful resource for understanding Anscombe's understanding of the doctrine of double effect. And the author writes, Anscombe defended a version of the doctrine of double effect, and her commitment to this doctrine provided a principle she used to try to show what was corrupt about Harry Truman's actions, specifically dropping the atomic... Oh no, it wasn't dropping the atomic bomb, it was terror bombing. Yeah, it was dropping the atomic bomb. The basic idea is that there is a morally relevant distinction between intended versus merely foreseen outcomes. There is a morally relevant distinction between intended versus merely foreseen outcomes. To intend harm is worse than to merely foresee harm as a result of one's action. So we're going to get to this example of terror bombing in a few slides, and this will help explain the difference between a foreseen versus intended harm. This can sometimes, we're still quoting the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, this can sometimes be combined with a kind of absolutism to hold that intended harms are forbidden, whereas the merely foreseen may not be. It is frequently used to try to underwrite a moral distinction between a strategic bomber and a terror bomber. What a strategic bomber does in dropping a bomb may be permissible because he does not intend to kill innocent civilians, even though he foresees that they will die as a result of the bombing. A terror bomber, on the other hand, does intend to kill innocent civilians as a way to achieve his aims. Okay, so you're a bomber, you're a strategic bomber during World War II, and you bomb a military silo containing nuclear weapons, for example. You intend to take out the military weapons. You foresee that you may kill some innocent persons that are near the silo, but what you intend to do is take out the weapons. That, according to the doctrine of double effect and Anscombe, would be permissible. However, a terror bomber, so the terror bombers in World War II, especially from, well, we'll just focus on the Allies. The Germans did a lot of that themselves, but the Allies would destroy whole cities as well. Like Dresden, for example, in Germany, was just decimated. And the idea was to inspire fear in the people, to get the enemy to stop their military actions against you. So that was intentional killing of innocents as a means to stopping the military, whereas strategic bombing was intentional taking out of military targets and just merely foreseeing that they would also kill innocents as a result. Okay, there is a moral, so she's saying there's a moral difference between the two actions. There are different types of actions. It's fine-grained, but there is a difference, and she's right. You can kind of distinguish actions by the types of intentions they have. I mean, it makes sense. Plays a huge role in our own legal system. That's why we have a distinction between, say, like voluntary and involuntary manslaughter, and the penalties for voluntary manslaughter are more severe, as they should be. Okay, so so this terror bombing and strategic bombing, also there's a difference, and I'm stressing this because in past when I've taught this course, students have not always grasped the difference, and then it has impacted arguments they've given, like papers, for example. So I really want to stress it. Okay, so let's contrast the doctrine of double effect with consequentialism. So with consequentialism, the end justifies the means. So in a consequentialist view, it is not morally wrong to intend and use bad means if the result is a good end. So terror bombing could be permissible under consequentialism. You intend to kill innocent persons as a means to ending the war, for example. However, the doctrine of double effect holds that it is morally wrong to intend bad means even if it is for a good result. Instead, what is intended must be morally good, for the action to be morally good or permissible, even if the non-intended effect is morally bad, such as the death of a person. So, according to the doctrine of double effect, it's morally wrong to intend bad means, like killing. It's morally wrong to intentionally kill innocent persons, even if you get the good result of, say, ending a war. Instead, what is intended must be morally good. So it's okay to intentionally take out a military target, which I get is morally good, I suppose, for the action to be morally good or permissible, even if the non-intended effect is morally bad. So you intentionally take out a military target, whereas you unintentionally take out innocence. So a very unpopular phrase during the Iraq War was collateral damage. I'm not sure if collateral damage is the same thing as the doctrine of double effect. That might be something we could discuss on the discussion boards. But there is a difference between quote-unquote collateral damage and like just intentional killing of innocents. But that's actually a worthwhile discussion. Of course, a pacifist might take issue with collateral damage as well. And in fact, you don't even have to be a pacifist to take issue with collateral damage. But we'll get to that later. Okay, here's an illustration then. I've used this illustration between tactical and terror bombing, or strategic bombing. And I'm going to revisit the illustration, just so I can guarantee that we understand the difference between consequentialism and the doctrine of double effect, and just, I guess, the alleged moral difference between actions to satisfy one versus the other. So terror bombing, which was popular during World War II, is when a bomber aims to bring about civilian deaths. So intends, in order to weaken the resolve of the enemy. The bomber intends the consequences of civilian deaths. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Dresden. Terror bombings, basically. Terror bombing, then, is justified on a consequentialist framework because it could bring about good consequences. But it's morally wrong according to this doctrine of double effect. Tactical, and this is, and Elizabeth Anscombe defends the doctrine of double effect. Tactical bombing aims at military targets, while foreseeing that bombing such targets will cause civilian deaths. So you're not taking out civilian targets, you're taking out military targets, and you foresee that innocent non-military people will die. Tactical bombing is justified both by consequentialism and by the doctrine of double effect. For what is intended is the bombing of a military target, and civilian deaths are not means to that end, and are also not intended. Okay, here's another illustration from trolleys or trains. It would be wrong to throw someone into the path of a runaway trolley in order to stop it and keep it from hitting 5 people on the track. So suppose you find out there's 5 people tied to a train tracks, and there's like a really fat person on a bridge ahead of them on the tracks. And you could stop the trolley from running over the 5 people if you push the fat person onto the tracks, which would stop the trolley. That would be wrong according to the doctrine of double effect, but okay according to consequentialism. However, it would be permissible to divert a runaway trolley onto a track holding 1 and away from a track holding 5. In that case, one foresees the death of the 1 as a side effect of saving the 5, but one does not intend it. So another case would be where you got the track splitting, and I gave this example in the consequentialism presentation. And if it goes left, it kicks out 1 person. If it goes right, it takes out 5. Well, if you divert the train to go left, which will kill the 1 person, you would intend to kill that 1 person. Instead, you would be intending to save the 5 lives. And you would foresee the killing of the 1 as a side effect of saving the 5. So that would be acceptable according to the doctrine of double effect. So those two examples, tactical and terror bombing, and this Charlie example, should show that there is a big moral difference between the two, between foreseeing and intending a bad result. Students sometimes deny this, but I have yet to see a student deny this and also demonstrate that the student understands it. So so there is a difference. Okay. So that's the doctrine of double effect. And Anscombe's going to argue that the denial of the doctrine of double effect leads to the killing of innocents, as well as pacifism. So let's look at the second half of this argument, the influence of pacifism. So first off, let's take a look at her characterization of pacifism. She says pacifism is eo ipso, by the deed itself, wrong to fight in wars. So if you're a pacifist, you just think it's just wrong to fight in wars. So how does pacifism then result in more violence, especially immoral violence against the innocent? Well, she writes, the turning of counsels and the precepts results in high-sounding principles. Principles that are mistakenly high and strict are a trap. They may easily lead in the end directly or indirectly to the justification of monstrous things. For example, a counsel forbidding property owning result in people paying lip service but in practice going for swindling. Okay, so here's an example. In the United States, you can't drink until you're 21 years old, right? Whereas in Europe, you know, everyone's having glasses of wine when they're 12. So it's just not a big deal. And so the United States, some people would say that our drinking laws are too restrictive. Like, if you join the military at age 18, you should be able to have a beer. So the story goes, if you make alcohol, which is not drinking alcohol, which is not in and of itself a bad thing, too restrictive, like, oh, you can't have a beer until you're 21. Not only will persons under the age of 21 drink, they'll drink to excess. So, supposing it's okay to drink a beer, but it's wrong to drink a bunch of beers. It's wrong to drink, to the point where you're inebriated. Well, if you make it illegal not only to just drink to the point of inebriation, but to just drink it all, then you're more likely to not just drink, but you're also more likely to drink to the point of inebriation. So that, they say, Americans don't know how to handle their alcohol because they're not even allowed to drink until they're a certain age, whereas in Europe, you start drinking when you're 12. So just the excitement of having it for the first time just isn't there. So people there, they don't drink as much as we do here. That's kind of what Anscombe's saying about killing of innocents, or just killing in general. The pacifist is too restrictive. They say not only should you not kill innocents, you just shouldn't kill at all. And if you forbid killing at all, then others will see this as too high of a precept, moral code to live up to. So not only will they just resort to killing against their quote-unquote moral code, they'll kill innocents. They'll take it too far. That's what she's saying is happening with pacifism, basically. Okay. So how does pacifism then result in more violence, especially immoral violence against the innocent? She writes, now, it is one of the most vehement and repeated teachings of the Judeo-Christian tradition that the shedding of innocent blood is forbidden by divine law. No man may be punished except for his own crime, and those whose feet are swift to shed innocent blood are always represented as God's enemies. So basically, yeah, you don't kill the innocent, you don't punish the innocent. So she continues, now pacifism teaches people to make no distinction between the shedding of innocent blood and the shedding of human blood. So pacifism teaches people to make no distinction between the shedding of innocent blood and the shedding of human blood. Just like if you make alcohol too restrictive, suppose also, whoops. Sorry about that. That sound, that noise, a Dalek from Doctor Who, was my phone ringing. I should have put it on silent. I guess I could have edited it out, but Anyways, I'll just start the quote from the top. Now, pacifism teaches people to make no distinction between the shedding of innocent blood and the shedding of human blood. Just like prohibition alcohol, there's no difference between drinking to excess. And in this way, pacifism has corrupted enormous numbers of people who will not act according to its tenets. They become convinced that a number of things are wicked which are not. Hence, seeing no way of avoiding wickedness, they set no limits to it. So if you're not against drinking, but you're against drinking to excess, prohibition will tell you that drinking in general is wicked, when it's not. And as soon as you see that, as soon as you're led to believe that that's not wicked, there's no principled way to distinguish between that and drinking to excess. So she thinks the same things happen with war. So suddenly, pacifism tells us that all killing is bad. Well, gosh, it used to be just killing of innocents. Intentional killing of innocents was bad, but now all killing is bad. But there's no way to avoid the wickedness of killing. We're going to be attacked by the Germans. So, well, then if there's no moral difference between killing and killing intentionally killing innocents, then, and both are wrong, but you have to do one to survive, then since there's no moral difference, might as well do what was originally bad, intentional killing of innocents, because there's no moral difference. That's the thrust. Okay, so what are some takeaways from Anscombe's article? According to Anscombe, pacifism is too restrictive and is therefore false. When moral codes, theories, ideologies are too restrictive, people tend to not only do what the false moral code falsely says is bad, but they also, as they have false beliefs about what is bad and think that it's not possible to abstain, tend to do what is really bad. For example, the killing of innocents intentionally is bad. Killing in and of itself, on the other hand, is not bad, even though pacifism says it is. So realizing that it's almost impossible to live up to pacifism's false dictates in this crazy world, it's a jungle, remember, people tend to not only live up to its false dictates, but all of its dictates. That is, people tend to not live up to its false dictates, and they also tend to not live up to any of its dictates, including the true ones. So pacifism says all killing of it is bad. That entails that the intentional killing of innocents is bad. So pacifism entails some truths. Okay. Back to double effect. The distinction between the intended and the merely foreseen effects of a voluntary action is indeed absolutely essential to Christian ethics, according to Anscombe. All right. Without understanding, according to Anscombe, of this principle, anything can be and is wont to be justified in the Christian teaching that in no circumstances may one commit murder, adultery, apostasy, to give a few examples, goes by the board. These absolute prohibitions of Christianity by no means exhaust its ethic. There is a large area where what is just is determined partly by a prudent weighing of consequences, but the prohibitions are bedrock, and without them the Christian ethic goes to pieces. Hence the necessity of the notion of double effect. There, you need it.